Before presenting you Monika Tru, I will introduce the topic of today's lecture. There have been long debates about the meaning for the ancient Greek of two words that name the buildings devoted to education, gymnasium and palaestra. In inscription and ancient text, the term gymnasium can name a building with a peristyle courtyard, but also the architectural complex as a whole, or sometimes not a construction, but the institution related to the education of young men. If gymnasia always belong to the public sphere, palaestra are often private schools in ancient literature. This word names sometimes places for the education of young boys, the paides, as gymnasia are more often related to the epheboi and the young adults. But in many cities, age groups shared the gymnasia and palaestrae without making any functional distinction. Jean Delorme proposed the following terminology, namely a strictly architectural distinction without taking into account the differences between text, cities, and periods. According to Delorme's terminology, the word gymnasium refers to an architectural complex, including a part with running tracks and buildings, sometimes with a peristyle like in Priene that you see on the screen. And the word palaestra refers to a building with a central courtyard and some adjacent room, including a bathing area and a changing room called apoditerion. This is the place where young men practice mainly wrestling, from the Greek verb palaio. During the Hellenistic period, the apoditerion, that was furnished with benches, became the room for intellectual education. The long jump, javelin, and discus throw, different races and military exercises needed more space and therefore took place in an open area outside the palaestra. Remains of gymnasia have been discovered in a large area from Italy to actual Afghanistan, namely in the maximal extension of ancient Greek culture. Ancient texts, mainly inscription, mention the existence of gymnasia in many other cities of the Hellenistic world, and they are not shown on these two maps that show only the places where buildings interpreted as gymnasia have been extensively or almost extensively excavated. Many historians have already highlighted the role of the gymnasia in the spread of the Greek way of living to the east during the Hellenistic period, in particular in Cyrenaica in Egypt and as far as Bactria, with the famous gymnasium of Ackermann. But Greek colonies in southern Italy and Sicily also played a major part in the development of the public architecture devoted to education, sports, and bathing culture, as will our speaker demonstrate later. I will not present you today a comprehensive history of the architectural development of the gymnasia, but only stress major steps of the long history during a millennium from the 6th century BC to the 4th century AD. Before the late classical period, gymnasia were open-air areas outside the fortification. The oldest gymnasia we know are those of the city of Athens from the 6th century BC. According to ancient texts, the most famous one, the Academy, was a large park a few kilometers away from the fortification and equipped with a very basic infrastructure, open-air sanctuaries, running tracks, dromoi, and a peribolos. According to Jean Delorme and many other scholars after him, it is only at the end of the classical period that peristyle buildings, that we call palaestrae, were built in the gymnasia. At the Academy of Athens, this building is considered to be the tetragonos peristylos, but its dates of construction within the 4th century remains unfortunately unclear. At Eretria, excavation conducted in 2018 in the South Palaestra revealed, however, that its first phase, in red on the screen, goes back as early as the late 5th century BC. Moreover, according to Jean Delorme, gymnasia are not incorporated within the fortification before the end of the classical period and remain parks in the neighboring countryside. The South Palaestra of Eretria proves, however, that in some cities, gymnasia were built in the town and with a palaestra as early as the late 5th century BC. According to several inscriptions, the Gymnasium of Delphi has been built in the years of Alexander the Great. It is considered by Jean Delorme as the first example of gymnasium that is integrated in the fortification and that forms an architectural complex, including a palaestra with a peristyle courtyard, an outdoor bath with a large swimming pool, the lutron, and for the first time, a running track under a portico, the xystos. Several other palaestrae were built in other gymnasia in the late 4th century and later on during the Hellenistic period. I shall emphasize here that there is not a single template for these buildings and that their design depends on many factors. The space available, the topography, and the building materials had a major impact. One of the main innovations of the Hellenistic period, in comparison with the example of the classical period, is the incorporation of the bathing facilities within the building with 1 or 2 rooms equipped with basins supplied with cold water. We also observed during the Hellenistic period the multiplication of exedrae with benches that were used as undressing and dressing rooms, but also as classrooms for the intellectual education that plays an increasingly important role in the late Hellenistic period, according to inscriptions. Another progress in the gymnasia is the introduction during the late Hellenistic period of hot bathing facilities. The gymnasium of Palaestrae is one of the very few examples where a dry steam room or pediaterion has been built as early as the 2nd century BC, which is very early in this new trend to offer a warm room to the young man. In many gymnasia, but not in all of them, thermal baths with an hypocaust as a heating system in red on the screen were built in the 1st centuries AD next to the Palaestra, like in Pergamon and Delphi that you see on the screen. In many cases, like in the upper gymnasium of Priene, the construction of this new bathing infrastructure completely reshaped the previous building. This fascinating conversion of gymnasia with a large courtyard, mainly devoted to athletic activities, into large thermal complexes with a focus on bathing and leisure has been studied by many scholars in 2 areas of the ancient Mediterranean. In Asia Minor, huge baths were built in several cities like Miletus and Ephesus in the 2 first centuries AD. The courtyard becomes secondary compared to the bathing rooms. The study of Italian baths of the Republican era, in particular those of Pompeii, played a major role in our understanding of the birth and development of Roman baths, an architectural design that will be spread all around the Mediterranean during the imperial period, and that will contribute to reshape the daily life in ancient cities. I will stop my introduction here to let Monika Tru present you this particular topic, but before giving her the floor, let me introduce her. Monika Tru belonged to the eminent scholar whose career and scientific work cannot be presented in a few minutes. You did not connect to this seminar to hear me loud or quest for hours, so I will just highlight some steps of her career and mention her main work and publications. Monika Tru studied classical archaeology, art history, and ancient history at the universities of Köln, Munich, and Paris. In her dissertation, she proposed a new study of the many houses of the Hellenistic period excavated by the French school at Delos in the Cyclades. She published this significant work in 1998 in an impressive book called Wohnen in Delos, eine baugeschichtliche Untersuchung zum Wandel der Wohnkultur in hellenistischer Zeit. After a PhD, Monika Tru traveled around the Mediterranean with the prestigious Reisestipendium of the German Archaeological Institute, and then became scientific assistant in the Institute for Classical Archaeology at the University of Heidelberg. Her career became then after more and more international by crossing the Atlantic Ocean and by working in several North American universities. She has been fellow in the Center for Hellenic Studies at Harvard University in Washington, visiting assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and assistant professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where she got the tenure and became full professor of classical archaeology. In 2013, she came back to Europe to become professor at the Freie Universität in Berlin, where she currently works and teaches. After studying the domestic architecture of Delos for a PhD, Monika Tru proposed for habilitation a new assessment of the Agora of the Italians in the same city, a work that she published in 2 volumes in 2008. The next year, she published another related book on the Greco-Roman slave markets, facts or fiction. The archaeologists of the French School also know her for a work on the other monument of Delos, among other the houses, the Établissement des Poseidonias de Peritos, the development of the Quartier du Théâtre, the baths, the brothels, and taverns, as well as the synagogue. But these are just few examples of a longer list of papers on Delos that makes it impossible to walk on the island without reading at one point Monika Tru. Since 2012, Monika Tru left Delos to a much bigger island, Sicily, to participate to the American excavation at Morgantina, where she conducted geophysical survey and then an excavation in collaboration with Sandra Lucore on the Greek bath and in the sanctuary of Demeter, a research interest developed in the direction of bathing culture. Among a dozen of publications on this topic, the best example is the proceedings of an international conference published in 2013 on Greek baths and bathing culture, new discoveries and approaches. Since 2015, she's directing another project on the Republican baths and Stabian Baths at Pompeii, and a work on bathing culture led her finally to the gymnasia, first with the organization of an international conference in 2016 with Ulrich Mania on the development of gymnasia and Greco-Roman cityscapes that was held at Berlin, to which I was lucky enough to participate. And second, with a new field project since some years in the Gymnasium of Agrigento that she will present us tonight. So let me express again my warmest thanks to Monika Tru for a virtual visit. Monika Tru, the floor is yours.
Greek gymnasia in the Eastern Mediterranean have received significant attention in research, and Guy just gave you a brief summary, and I will only briefly repeat some important facts. As a recognizable building type, gymnasia were developed in the 4th century BC. They quickly spread in the Eastern Mediterranean and were often used well into the Roman Imperial period. While no 2 gymnasia look alike, well-appointed gymnasia commonly included, and we've just heard this, a palaestra with a peristyle courtyard very often, and rooms for athletic intellectual training. Bathing facilities in the palaestra are rarely next to it, and racetracks, which can be covered, xystos, uncovered, paradromis, and provided with tribunes for judges and an audience in a stadion. Not all athletic facilities were provided with racetracks, however. Buildings with peristyle courtyards were popular at least from the 4th century BC onwards and cannot always be easily identified as palaestrae. Burkhard Emmer recently argued that the presence of large exedra, which I marked red, or he marked red on the left side, I try also the laser pointer, yeah, that should work, and particularly bathing facilities marked blue is conclusive for identifying palaestrae, and therefore the ones on the left could be palaestrae, while the ones on the right, according to Emmer, should not be classified as palaestrae. And we've already seen typical bathing facilities that most often included rooms, as on the left, with wash basins or tubs that were set up on high feet or into the floors along the walls and supplied with cold running water for collective ablutions of body and feet. Gymnasia were much more rarely equipped with pools, as you can see on the upper right, for collective immersion or even swimming in cold water, maybe from the 4th or 3rd century BC onwards, or with round sweat bath laconica from the 2nd century BC onwards. Against this background, the question arises of what happened in the Western Mediterranean, where the Greeks had founded many colonies from the 8th century BC onwards, and where many cities had cultural contacts with Greek polis well before the 4th century BC. The aim of my paper is to discuss this, focusing on the following questions. Were the above-mentioned key features also standard in the West? And did Western gymnasia enjoy an equal popularity and equally long life as in the East? After a brief assessment of the state of research and of textual sources, I focus on the archaeological evidence and first discuss two case studies based on my own fieldwork in Agrigento and Pompeii, and then other examples. And the conclusion attempts to answer my key questions. In his magisterial study of gymnasia from 1960, Jean Delorme discussed Western gymnasia only briefly, referring to the relevant literary and epigraphic evidence. In the past 25 years, some synthetic studies on gymnasia or related topics have appeared, but these are mostly articles focused on limited aspects. Two books, marked yellow here, have been dedicated to the gymnasiarchy and the Italian Roman campus, and one dissertation on gymnasia in Sicily remained unpublished and inaccessible. An updated comprehensive study that would include all textual and archaeological evidence related to the gymnasium as an institution and a building type in the West is missing. In 1997, Giuseppe Cordiano compiled epigraphic evidence that testified to the existence of the gymnasiarchy in 18 Western cities, most of which are in Sicily. And the majority of these inscriptions has been dated to the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. 10 years later, Jonathan Prague added several Sicilian cities to this list based on literary sources. Most important is the often cited passage from Athenaios, who refers to the king of Syracuse in the 3rd century BC, here on the 2nd, who, quote, was attentive to the furnishing of temples and gymnasia. Based on textual sources, historians and epigraphers like Prague and Giacomo Manganaro have argued that every single Sicilian city would have had a gymnasium in the late Hellenistic or late Republican period. The archaeological evidence does not match up with this, however. So far, not a single complete gymnasium of the standard type mentioned above is known from the entire Western Mediterranean. The only one that comes close to it and may indeed have conformed to this standard is the Gymnasium of Agrigento. Agrigento was founded as a Greek colony in 580 BC with a surface area of 450 hectares, and an orthogonal grid plan was established in the late 6th or early 5th century BC, and you see that here on the recently reconstructed plan. The city thrived, particularly after the famous Battle of Himera in 480 BC, but suffered severe consequences after Carthaginian occupation in 465 BC. Relatively little is known from literary sources about Hellenistic and Roman Agrigento, but while the settled area was much smaller than in archaic and classical times, there was significant investment in public buildings, including a theater, bouleuterion, ecclesiasterion, several sanctuaries, a gymnasium, and lavishly decorated houses. The city received the status of a municipium under Augustus and of a colonia under Septimius Severus. The gymnasium is located in a valley between the city's agora here to the north and the southern row of sanctuaries and temples, and its function is securely identified by inscriptions and its plan. The building was excavated between 1960 and 2005 and published in several preliminary reports by Graziella Fiorentini. Excavations focused on the northern part of a racetrack section and a pool, which are located on either side of a small ravine that I've marked in blue here on the map. The racetrack section covers an east-west direction, one insular lot of 35 meters width between two stenopoi and over 200 meters in north-south direction. It included, you see here on the left side is a state plan. It's a little bit confusing because of multiple phases. On the right side is my reconstructed plan, maybe a little bit easier to read. So the racetrack section included a stoa or porticus here, xystos of 7 meters width, and an open racetrack of about 17 meters width, subdivided by two facing rows here of inscribed seats. This is the paradromis, and then a hydraulic complex, an exedra-shaped structure, and an altar, and then possibly a tribune with seats. The excavated pool section is narrow at about 17 meters. You can see this probably well here, and its context and extension to the north are unknown. While the connection between the two sections has been destroyed by the ravine, Fiorentini reconstructed a large ramp to cover the 1.30 to 60 meters difference between the racetrack complex located on a lower level and the pool situated on a higher terrace. And here are two photos of the 2005 excavations, and you see it's a little bit confusing because of the multiple phases, but I tried to show you what remains. So here's the eastern stenopos, and then you see the remains of the altar. I marked the seats in blue. Between and around them, the paradromis, you see the ravine in the background and the pool in the very background. And moving a little bit to the west, you can see the remains of the stoa or xystos here with the stylobate and the back wall, the west stenopos, and then again here, the seats. Fiorentini proposed that the gymnasium was constructed in the late 2nd century BC on open terrain, but the stratigraphy inside the building and Greek inscriptions on the architrave of the stoa and seats suggest that at least some, if not all currently visible remains, belong to the Augustan period. The remains of the seats are marked blue, and some of them have been transported to the museum. The inscribed seats were dedicated most likely by a Roman gymnasiarch during the reign of the Emperor Augustus, when Agrigento had a flamen and duo viri. So here's a reconstruction by Fiorentini with also a translation by Fiorentini. And you see the remains of this inscription on the back wall of the seats. Finally, the architrave of the stoa was also constructed or repaired when Agrigento had duo viri. And finally, roof tiles with the stamp gym were found in the destruction debris of the gymnasium. The single published phase plan differentiates only between 4 phases in the Augustan period, here orange, the Constantinian era, yellow, the 7th century AD, and the 8th to 19th centuries AD. Destruction deposits would suggest that the gymnasium was abandoned as a gymnasium around 200 to 250 AD and reoccupied from the 4th century AD onwards for different purposes, which are not discussed here. Since central questions regarding the important complex could not be answered after the last campaign in 2005, a team of the Freie Universität Berlin started a new fieldwork project in 2019 with generous support of the Parque Archeologico Valle dei Templi, particularly Dr. Maria Concetta Parello, and in cooperation with colleagues from the British School at Rome and the Politecnico di Bari. Our aim is to investigate the extension and design of the gymnasium, namely the existence and location of a palaestra, its history and development, as well as its urban context. We studied and documented the remains on site, correlated them with published and unpublished data from the archives of the Parque Archeologico, and integrated them into a new georeferenced AutoCAD plan. So this is just one example. It's a very long plan from the earliest excavations by Griffo in 1960. It's never been published. He did a lot of trial trenches all along the stoa here, and I cannot present you our new AutoCAD plan because it's simply way too big to be shown in a reasonable way. The stoa, marked green here, or the whole racetrack section, was about 201 meters long, extending from remains here in a modern house in the south to the excavated remains in the ravine. Based on a comparison with Eastern gymnasia, the possible location of a palaestra in relation to the racetrack complex was identified. While a location to the north here of a palaestra in relation to the racetrack complex, while a location to the north of the otherwise strangely isolated pool here seems most likely, other locations, marked also red here, could not be excluded. In 2020, a geophysical survey was carried out in all of these locations using magnetometry and ground-penetrating radar. The general conditions for the geophysical survey were not ideal due to the fragmented nature of the study area, olive groves and other vegetation, as well as substantial spread of modern metallic rubbish, but it still succeeded in locating features of potential archaeological interest. Most anomalies were found in field 1 to the north of the pool. The features which correspond to the orientation of the excavated walls to the south in part appear to cross the projected line of the stenopos marked blue here. This is particularly interesting because these walls might testify to the existence of a palaestra that was wider than 35 meters and extended over the western stenopos. The stenopos, which is still clearly visible at the height of the pool, could have led to the entrance of the palaestra. Otherwise, astonishingly few features were recorded to the west and particularly east of the racetrack, but traces of a possible third stenopos were identified in this area. This suggests that the insula of the racetrack and the insula west of it both were about 35 meters wide. Whether and when the insulae to the east and west were built can only be clarified by excavation. In this year's September excavation campaign, we will focus on field 1 and investigate the potential palaestra in a couple of trenches between the olive trees. You see the olive trees here. In future years, we intend to also explore the areas to the west and east of the racetrack for assessing the urban context in more detail. I conclude the discussion of Agrigento's gymnasium with a brief assessment of the pool. Several walls constructed of limestone ashlars are today visible on both sides of the ravine and on all sides of the pool. Since these do not appear on the published state plan, we have surveyed and recorded them in order to understand and reconstruct the crucial connection between the racetrack section and the pool. These walls were founded at astonishingly different levels and have marked the extremes, so the lowest at 66.18 above sea level and the highest at 70.74 above sea level. And they were all founded on a bed of yellow-bluish clay that was found everywhere in the excavated areas. This plan shows that all these walls follow the same orientation. While we still have to do further surveys and final evaluations of the situation, it is clear that the pool was accessible via circa 10 steps from the south, and it was surrounded by walkways at least in the west, the north, and the east, and most likely also in the south, and it was surrounded by walls in the west, in the north, most likely in the south, and possibly somewhere also here in the east. The pool area was most likely uncovered and accessible from a room or courtyard somewhere here in the east. The strange ramp must be discarded, and it is much more likely that the difference of 1.30 to 60 meters between the racetrack and the pool walkway was bridged by a staircase in maybe the northeast corner of the racetrack section. This reminds of the situation in Delphi, where a staircase led from the racetracks on the upper terrace down to the lutron, an uncovered terrace with pool and tubs. And I've marked the lutron blue and the staircase in red. And you see here on the reconstruction, again, the staircase, or here in the plan. As mentioned above, pools were rare as they usually had to be supplied by running water. And the examples in Delphi and Agrigento are the only securely contextualized examples in gymnasia. They also are of astonishingly similar sizes and depth. In sum, the gymnasium of Agrigento may have been a true Eastern type gymnasium, albeit built only in the late Hellenistic or Augustan period with luxury bathing facilities and a hybrid racetrack system that combined a xystos and an open-air racetrack with seating for an audience. The inscribed seats, the exedra, and the altar may have been added later and actually restrict the space for running, but the probably wooden tribune and water channel system, which has parallels in the gymnasium of Delphi and the stadium of Nemea, belong to the original concept. Yeah, they are integrated actually into the back wall of the gymnasium. Remarkable is the investment of Roman magistrates in the construction or maintenance and embellishment of the gymnasium and the use until the early 3rd century AD. Pompeii did not have a gymnasium like the nearby Greek city Neapolis, but it provides one of two examples in the late Republican and early Imperial Western Mediterranean for the dedication of a palaestra, and the other is Aquinum, which I've also marked on the map here. After 80 BC, two duoviri of the newly founded Roman colony saw to the construction of a laconicum and a districtarium and to the restoration of a portico or porticos and the palaestra. The inscription was carved on a reused tabletop and stored in a narrow staircase when Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD. Similarly, in the Augustan period, a duovir of the Colonia Aquinum donated, this time not from public but from his own money, baths for men and women, a crypta, a palaestra, and the decoration. This was commemorated in a mosaic inscription in the men's frigidarium. I've circled this here in yellow, but focus is here on the much older Stabian Bath. The Stabian Baths are prominently located at the intersection of the city's two major streets, the Via Stabiana and the Via dell'Abbondanza. In their last stage of use, they occupied a terrain of about 3,300 square meters and included 5 different functional sections. So marked blue is a bathing section of men with entrances from 3 different streets, then a palaestra, a natatio flanked by nymphaea, and the canonical sequence of apoditerium, frigidarium, tepidarium, and caldarium. Then marked red the section for women with 2 entrances from different streets, and only an apoditerium with a kind of frigidarium and a tepidarium and a caldarium. Then is a section, a strange section here with 4 cells of unknown function and a large latrine, only accessible from the men's section. In yellow is the service section, with the heating facilities and deep well and a reservoir on top of the roof. And then finally brown are 20 tavernae in the west and in the south. Excavated in the mid-19th century, stratigraphic trenches to investigate the history were dug in 1940 by Heinrich Sulze and in the 1970s by Hans Eschebach, both architects, who published a monograph in 1979. Eschebach proposed a suggestive model of urban and cultural development. In the 6th century BC, the terrain of the bath would have been crossed by the fortifications of the archaic city. In the 5th century BC, a Greek palaestra here with a separate bathing complex would have been built and then gradually developed in 5 phases into the sophisticated Roman thermal complex that was buried by Vesuvius in 79 AD. This would have been, next to the example in Retria that we've just seen, the earliest known built palaestra in the entire Mediterranean. So you see the reconstruction of this crucial original phase below here. While Eschebach's developmental model had been repeatedly criticized in scholarship, systematic reassessment has been initiated only in 2015 within the frame of an interdisciplinary project between the universities of Berlin, Naples, and Oxford. And you see here, thanks are owed to a lot of people and institutions who support our project. And we have a large interdisciplinary and international team here, and a lot of different universities are also involved. Based on the study of architecture and decoration and stratigraphic excavations in 22 areas, which you see here, we can reconstruct the development of the Stabian Bath in 4 phases. This is our current phase plan. The baths were built on unbuilt terrain after 125 BC and remodeled 3 times, after 80 BC, in the Augustan period, and after the earthquake of 62 AD. Thus, Eschebach's earliest phases from the 6th to 3rd century BC did simply not exist. So all of these are actually fiction. This development, as we reconstruct it, correlates well with the history and urban development of the city. So the city was founded in the 6th century BC, about whom is not quite clear, and the Samnites took over in the 5th and 4th century BC. There's very little, there are very little remains. They're usually the Dark Ages. We have nothing in the bath. And then we see a gradual monumentalization, or actually the heyday of the Samnite city in the late 2nd century BC, when the baths were also built. Then Pompeii was transformed into a Roman colony. This is our phase 2, and saw another period of urban monumentalization under Augustus, our phase 3. Then we have the large devastating earthquake in 62 AD, followed by many smaller ones until the city was buried by Vesuvius. The above mentioned inscription clearly documents that a palaestra and porticos or portico were part of the initial concept, because both were only repaired in phase 2 after 80 BC. We have tried to reconstruct the original plan of the Stabian Bath and to understand the cultural concept. Last year's excavation in the courtyard provided crucial and completely unexpected results for assessing this concept. So you see here an orthophoto of the ongoing excavation. We found a laconicum with a diameter of 7.50 meters here in the southwest corner of the courtyard. And I've marked on the following plan a couple of features in color, so you can better understand, because there are several phases. In blue are the walls of the laconicum, and it was accessible via a narrow entrance in the northeast here. There is some kind of a socle for an unknown heating installation in the center. And then the room was also flanked by a corridor in the east. There may have been additional rooms here, but you see that unfortunately we didn't have any time to excavate them. Because of these findings, we now reconstruct the original plan of the Stabian Bath as follows. So in the center here is a fully rectangular palaestra of 35.20 by 19.50 meters, which must have had at least one portico, but had most likely 3 porticos in the northeast and south as reconstructed here. The bathing section with 2 row-type suites and state-of-the-art technology. So you have here the men's section, and marked here are hypothesized systems that actually covered the entire floors. Here is the women's section marked in red, and these were located to the east of this palaestra. The laconicum, in contrast, was located to the west in a kind of unfortunately shaped triangular rest terrain that resulted from a change of orientation in the southern Via del Abbondanza and the entire insula. And the terrain to the west here, marked gray, was occupied by a house from the mid-1st century BC onwards at the latest. The northwestern section included the deep wall with reservoir on the roof and 5 cells of unknown function, probably used for massage or relaxing or other treatments. While centrally located, the palaestra had no monumental entrance and was only accessible from the men's section or outside. The different features of the complex are clearly separated, and the laconicum is strangely isolated. This looks like the experimental combination of 2 different cultural and functional concepts: a palaestra with typical gymnasial bathing facility, namely a laconicum, use of which was typically restricted to men, and a new type of public bath with canonical sequence of apoditerium, tepidarium, caldarium for both men and women. Both types were only introduced in the 2nd century BC. The map shows that laconica were integrated in a broad variety of architecture contexts in the late Hellenistic period, in the east as well as in the west, and in palaestrae and public bath alike. The size of the laconicum in the Stabian Bath, 7.15 meters in diameter, confirms its conceptual link with palaestrae. While laconica included in palaestrae range from 6.70 to 10.20 meters in diameter, laconica integrated into public bath do not exceed 6.50 meters and are mostly even much smaller. A scale-to-scale comparison of late Hellenistic public bath with laconica in Italy shows that the laconicum had no standard position. So it could be linked, for example, to the apoditerium as in Norba, to the tepidarium as in Aletrium, to a caldarium as probably in Paestum, or separate rooms as in Cales or in Croton. It was never included in the row-type sequence of bathing rooms. That the laconicum was a foreign body that was gradually introduced into the new concept of public bath is nowhere as obvious as in the Stabian bath, however, where it is grouped with a palaestra. And the few independent palaestrae with laconica, the side bath is usually grouped with the main rooms in the north or south, but the accessibility varies. In general, the laconicum was a more integral part of the room program of the palaestrae than in the Stabian bath. The experimental hybrid concept of the original Stabian bath was not successful. There are no parallels or followers, and it was abandoned after 80 BC, when the Duoviri built an entirely new laconicum in the men's bathing section that was accessible from an anteroom of the apoditerium. The old laconicum was destroyed and the palaestra enlarged. The new laconicum was slightly smaller with a diameter of 6.50 meters, but it was much more solidly built and fashionable, being decorated, as you can see here on the right, with 4 symmetrically placed niches. While much better integrated than the first laconicum, the second was also not a major indispensable feature of the complex because it was transformed into a frigidarium in the Augustan period. Thus, it was in turn easily sacrificed for yet another new fashionable feature. In sum, the Stabian baths reflect a remarkable development in combining different cultural traditions into new concepts. So first here, you have a palaestra laconicum versus bath in the 2nd century BC, which has no parallel so far and whose emergence in late Hellenistic Samnite Pompeii is hard to explain from a cultural and social historical point of view. This concept was transformed to a bath with palaestra by the Roman colonists after 80 BC, and to yet a new concept after the earthquake of 62 AD, when a large natatio with mper was added to the palaestra at the expense of the former house. While on first sight reminiscent of palaestra with pool, like the above mentioned examples in Delphi and Agrigento, the design and lavish decoration of the pool section and its direct connection with the palaestra clearly differentiated from the former. And I show you here the cork model because that still shows the lavish decoration of these rooms, which is lost today. It is questionable whether bathers associated this luxurious ensemble with hard physical training and subsequent aesthetic cleansing cold immersion bath, or with a traditional mundane Greek palaestra. The inscription that mentioned the palaestra was at least no longer on display at this time, but stored possibly for some future reuse in an unused, inaccessible space. After the discussion of 2 entirely different complexes, both of which were clearly linked with gymnasial culture by inscriptions, I will provide a brief overview of other examples in the Western Mediterranean. This should show whether there are clearly identifiable types of athletic facilities and specific cultural preferences. Because of limited time, I will leave out the Italian Roman campus examined by Aldo Borlenghi in a monograph published in 2011, and I will not discuss public baths with peristyle courtyards anymore, although they were popular from the 1st century BC onwards. Instead, I will organize a discussion along the key features of Eastern gymnasia and first examine racetrack complexes and then palaestrae. I cannot provide complete lists, the lacking comprehensive discussion and full historical and social contextualization, and my assessment is biased, meaning mostly focused on southern Italy and Sicily, which I know best. The map and lists provided by Cordiano and Prague may be complete for Sicily, but are certainly not complete for the entire Western Mediterranean. Just for example, Strabo also mentions a gymnasium for Taranto, which does not figure on this list, on this map. Scholars have often attempted to identify gymnasia in the archaeological record of cities for which textual sources mention persons or groups related to gymnasia or even buildings. This is understandable, but not always successful and convincing. And so here marked red are the examples that I'm going to show in the following, and I will not mention or will not show the map again. Yeah, so Pompeii we've already seen. We'll see Solunto, Montillato, Acrae, Noto Antica, and Cava Dispica. Several topographical or built features have been identified as racetracks that would have been linked to Palaestrae or other built gymnasia features and conceived for permanent training of athletes. So streets, terraces in front of rock-cut rooms, or stoae or porticos in public spaces. In the late Hellenistic city of Solunto on the northern coast of Sicily, the main street here leading to the agora and a palaestra has been identified as a paradromis by Alessia Mistretta. For a length of 116 meters, this quite steeply rising street is paved with terracotta slabs that are arranged in a decorative pattern of 4 lanes. You see it in the photo and particularly here in the plan. 2 sets of each 3 lava blocks with cavities inserted in a distance of 47 meters from each other would have somehow served to hold some kind of starting mechanism. Thus, the lanes would have served for running. The identification of the main street as a paradromis is part of a larger concept involving the entire city center, which cannot be presented here, however, but which I've critically discussed in detail in a recent publication. It is sufficient to mention here that racetracks for humans and also animals were commonly not paved and not steeply inclined, and that regular training, let alone in the nude, did commonly not impede traffic in the main arteries of cities. Furthermore, in Eastern Gymnasia and possibly also in Agrigento, Palaestrae and racetracks were spatially directly linked, which is strangely not the case in Mistretta's concept of Solunto's gymnasium complex, because the racetrack ends here and the palaestra is here, or the racetrack even ends here at her so-called turning point. In Noto Antica, a group of rock-cut rooms and a terrace wall have been attributed to a gymnasium of the 3rd century BC, and this only based on an inscription found in situ that mentions here 2 gymnasiarchs and the Hieronian Nea Niskoi. The design, size, and function of the rock-cut rooms cannot be determined because they were never fully excavated. You can see this quite clearly here on my photos, and have no typologic comparison in Palaestrae. But the terrace here, with a width of 26 to 28 meters and a length of at least 90 meters, would have been sufficiently large for running and other exercises. This also regards a similar complex in Cava d'Ispica, a barely known settlement, where several rock-cut rooms have been excavated recently, and a terrace may have existed, whose extension is currently not known. So you see a schematic plan here, and you have a view of these rock-cut rooms and part of what may have been a terrace of unknown dimension. The conclusive inscriptions that mention different groups of the gymnasium, so neoi for neotoroi oder neoi und presbytoroi, have recently been dated to the late 1st century BC by Anna Maria Samito and Vittorio Rizzone, but they cannot date the rock-cut complex. The use of public porticos for running has been most prominently postulated for the Foro Triangolare in Pompeii that housed the Doric temple here from the 6th century BC onwards, but was connected in the 2nd century BC with the newly built Palaestra Sanitica marked red here. Based on the material and style of the Doric nocera tough columns, the porticos of the Foro Triangolare had long been dated to the late Hellenistic period and attributed to a gymnasium monumental complex or building project that would also have included the Palaestra Sanitica and the Republican Bath and even these yellow marked so-called Domus Publica. But this date was challenged by excavations first under Andrea Carandini and more recently under Massimo Osanna, which date the current appearance of the porticos to the post-earthquake period, thus after 62 AD. While no updated face plan of the Foro Triangolare in the 2nd century BC has yet been published, the existence of a portico of the xystos and paradromis must be revised. In some racetracks, let alone with the length of a stadium and a combination of covered and uncovered spaces, can currently barely be identified in the Western Mediterranean, and the example in Agrigento remains the single secure canonical example. Buildings with peristyle courtyards are as numerous in the West as in the East, and many of them have been tentatively identified as palaestrae. Criteria for identification include the type, notably the existence of a peristyle courtyard and bathing facilities, the size, which is larger than that of houses, the location, for example, close to the agora or to possible racetracks, and finds like inscriptions and statues. Of the 11 examples listed here, 3 marked yellow have been excluded in recent research with convincing arguments because they lack conclusive features. 2 marked light blue are unlikely for several reasons, and 3 marked red are problematic because have not been fully excavated or lack conclusive features. Only 3 marked white here can be securely identified as Palaestrae. I discuss only a few of these examples, starting with the secure ones. The Palaestrae of Solunto and Acra in Sicily were most likely built in the late 2nd century BC, and the existence of gymnasiacs is known from late Hellenistic inscriptions in both cities, even if these were not found in the buildings. Both buildings had most likely a peristyle courtyard with cisterns and a laconicum. The better known example in Solunto had some additional rooms. Racetracks cannot be securely identified for both of them. The luxurious laconica provide the common denominator with several eastern palaestrae, which usually had more rooms, however, than the small palaestra in Solunto, and were connected with racetracks at least in Eretria and maybe also in Tira. The Great Palaestra at Pompeii includes a peristyle courtyard with porticos on 3 sides, 2 parallel rows of trees in front of the porticos, a large pool in the center, and only very few rooms, notably a kind of shrine in the west and a latrine in the south. It is commonly dated to the Augustan period and identified as a multifunctional building conceived for use by the juvenes, young men for paramilitary training, but also by visitors of the nearby amphitheater or all kinds of other visitors for strolling, vending, and so on. The building is an intriguing hybrid concept between racetrack and palaestra, providing 338 meters of covered and uncovered racetracks and luxurious bathing facilities in the center. It does not resemble the Greek-type gymnasia in Delphi and Agrigento, even though it includes a pool. Moving to the less secure examples, a peristyle building in Montiato has recently been cautiously identified as a palaestra by Martin Moore, mainly because of its size, but also location. It is located in the northeastern part of the city on a terrace above houses and also the public buildings in the center here. Dated based on stratigraphy to the late 2nd of a century BC, Moore reconstruct the building with a size of 35.50 by 29.50 meters. No conclusive features like inscriptions or bathing facilities have been found yet, and no other inscriptions testify to the existence of gymnasiacs in Montiato. Moore mentions a complex drainage system in the southwest as a remarkable feature, which can, in my opinion, be identified as a latrine. So with a typical L-shaped channel here, and this is actually on 2 levels, and the upper part was accessible from the peristyle courtyard on the higher level. Latrines were not common in late Hellenistic Sicily in any context, but some have been found in houses and possibly public buildings. The latrine certainly does not allow to securely identify the function of the building in Montiato, and only future full excavation might provide conclusive clues. My last example is the Palaestra Sinaitica in Pompeii, which was probably built in the late 2nd century BC. The original building had a surface area of about 700 square meters and included a peristyle courtyard with maybe 1 or 2 rooms on the western side. The building has been unanimously identified as a palaestra in scholarship because of certain features, or rather, features have been attributed to this building to make it a real Greek palaestra, or of a Greek gymnasium or a Roman campus. An Oscan inscription found here records that a magistrate of the Semnite city dedicated a building for the Pompeian Virea, commonly identified as an equivalent of the Greek ephebeia. Because of its carving style, however, the inscription was probably carved after the earthquake of 62 AD on a reused marble tabletop, copying a lost older inscription. It is not known whether preserved and the potentially lost inscription were displayed. The urban context mentioned above played a major role because it presumably provided the building with crucial features, a paradromis and xystos in the Foro Triangulare, and bathing facilities in the Republican Bath. But the existence of the racetracks must now be challenged, as I've mentioned above, and a conceptual and functional connection to the Republican Bath has also been challenged because of chronological problems and the lacking spatial relationship within the frame of our project. The tough ensemble of altar, base, and staircase that served to venerate and crown an unknown statue was added later over the channel here of the peristyle courtyard. And while the date of the Doryphoros statue remains debated, an Augustan or Tiberian date seems most popular right now because of the style and the Luni marble that was used. According to Emma's criteria, the building should not be called a palaestra. If it was still used for athletic training, as suggested by its decoration, it exceeds the boundaries of our secure typological criteria. To conclude and come back to my initial question, the key features of Eastern gymnasia were no standard in the West. A complex of spatially linked racetracks, bathing facilities, and palaestra may only have been installed in Agrigento. There are other remarkable differences. No gymnasium or palaestra in the West can be securely dated to the 4th century BC, and only the unusual rock-cut complex in Noto Antica can be dated to the 3rd century BC based on an inscription. All other examples cited here were only built in the 2nd or 1st century BC, and the one in Agrigento may even have been built in the Augustan period at the initiative or with support of Roman magistrates. The most popular bathing facility of Eastern gymnasia, the lutron with tubs, is completely lacking in the West. Instead, the more lavish bathing facilities, pools, and laconica were installed. The most revolutionary step was certainly the combination of a palaestra with a fully developed, fashionable public bath complex that provided relaxing facilities with warm water, as in the Stabian Baths. But this combination was not realized in the East before the 1st century BC or even 1st century AD, as we've seen before. No clear linear development can be identified in the West, for example, from Eastern type gymnasia to new concepts. Instead, the different options shown here in a scale-to-scale comparison coexisted probably from the late 2nd century BC onwards. Marked yellow are terms known from related inscriptions. So gymnasiarchs in Greek, or gymnasium is the only one on the stamped tiles that I've shown. You have an Oscan inscription or then the Latin inscription referring to palaestra. These options belong to a wide variety of cultural and historical contexts. Greek and Punic foundations under Roman rule, or a Samnite city before and after its refoundation as a Roman colony. It is currently hard or impossible to establish clear-cut, reasonable typologies, except for the public bath with palaestra or peristyle courtyards. And this also makes it hard or impossible to answer my second question. In assessing athletic facilities in the Western Mediterranean, we should probably stop using the Eastern gymnasia as points of reference and desperately search for racetracks or try to identify peristyle buildings as palaestra. The Pompeian buildings were destroyed by Vesuvius in 79 AD, and the gymnasium of Agrigento was abandoned in the early 3rd century AD, but how long other athletic facilities were used as such is often unknown. If we look at the Stabian Bath in Pompeii, the most intriguing conceptual innovation was a combination of athletic and highly refined and differentiated bathing facility, and this tendency may be reflected in Vitruvius' description of the kind of maximum gymnasium that includes everything. Xystoi, paradromis, stadium, and a palaestra with exedrae, and a broad variety of bathing facilities, the old-fashioned Eastern type lutron, and basically every new cold and warm facility available in the West, hot and cold water pools, laconicum, sudatio, etc. No wonder that no Vitruvian example has yet been securely identified in the archaeological evidence of the entire Mediterranean, because Vitruvius' gymnasium or palaestra is a fiction, an ideal cultural and conceptual hybrid, unless excavation of the gymnasium at Agrigento will provide a palaestra with modern bathing facilities. But this naturally remains to be seen. Thank you very much for your attention.